Hello again, Year 8, and welcome to the Khan Academy's Year 8 lesson about the causes of World War I. You should have already completed a starter activity as part of your team's live introduction, and you'd have been told that our next topic is looking at the First World War. So let's make a start on this lesson. First of all, remember to make sure that you pause the video when I ask you to in order for you to complete the tasks, and also don't forget that your teachers are available on Teams for the entire lesson if you have any questions for them at all. First of all, Year 8, could I ask you to write down today's title, which is what were the main causes of World War I? Now, as the lesson progresses, you will find out what Maine stands for, and that will become a really important part of our plenary activity today as well. So get this title down. You may want to pause this for a second while you do that. Okay, Year 8, so our first activity is going to introduce you to what Europe looked like in the early 1900s. This is important because Europe looked very differently in the 1900s to what it does today. And you're going to get a bit more of a grasp from that by looking at these two images and comparing them, thinking about their similarities and their differences. So the first picture I'm asking you to look at is this one here, where you can see Europe in 1900. And the second picture is this one here, where you can see what Europe looks like today. The first thing I'd like to do, guys, is to write down the similarities and the differences that you spot within these two pictures. Now, the easiest way, I think, to log your points would be to do a small chart where you could do one side with similarities and one side with differences, and you could just bullet point the different things that you spot. Please have a go at doing this on your own and then continue with the lesson. I'd recommend that you pause it now while you have a really good look at these two pictures. Okay, guys, let's go through some of the key similarities and differences that you might have noticed. Just bear in mind that these images are from different angles. They do look slightly different in the sense that, for example, you can see Iceland in one picture, but you can't see it in the other one because it's further north. In terms of the things that have remained the same, you can see Spain and Portugal have remained the same. So has France, Belgium, the Netherlands look the same. The areas that have changed the most really are the areas in the centre part of Europe. So Central Europe, like Germany, Austria-Hungary and Russia have also significantly changed in this part of Central Europe. Because if you look at the new image, you can see that Germany, for example, is much smaller. Russia is also smaller. It's been pushed back further east and new nations have been created from that land. Poland, for example, is now independent. That used to be part of the German and Russian empires. And you can also see that the Austro-Hungarian Empire that was in the centre of Europe is now broken down into lots of little countries, including places like Austria, Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic. And basically, guys, this kind of shows that after the First World War, empires started to crumble. So there's another empire that's also shown in the 1900s, which is the Ottoman Empire. But you can't really see that in this one. It begins here with Turkey. Okay, so ultimately, an empire, if you're not sure of what one is, it's where one country has kind of conquered land in other parts of the world, and they control those areas, which are called colonies, and the person in control of the empire rules all of those nations. So let me give you an example. Like Britain used to have an extensive empire that spanned a quarter of the Earth's surface, and what that meant is that the British king or queen controlled lots of parts of the world. And what you've got to bear in mind, guys, is that when there is an empire, like even the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there are lots of different people living within that empire, different cultures, different languages, and they're all being controlled by one leader who perhaps doesn't understand their language and culture and is trying to force perhaps the leader's culture and language onto the people in the empire. And that's something that was really unpopular. So the people living within empires like the Austro-Hungarian Empire wanted their independence. They wanted to form nations of their own. And that's why you do see this breakdown of empires and obviously self-determination, self-control of smaller countries kind of merging. And that's why in the more modern picture, there are lots of smaller countries. Like you can see, the Russian Empire is broken down. You've now got areas like Estonia, you've got Latvia, you've got Lithuania, Ukraine, even Romania. Although it's present in the first picture, it's changed in size and shape, hasn't it? So basically, guys, you can see that the borders of Europe have massively changed. That's the biggest thing I wanted you to pick out from this picture. And the reason why I'm showing you this is because in the next couple of lessons, I will be referring to empires like Austria-Hungary. And obviously it doesn't exist today as an empire, and so I wanted to make you aware of where that empire would lie today. So I hope that's made a bit of sense, guys, and as we move forward into the lesson, you will hear me talking more about Austria-Hungary, but also about some other countries like Serbia, which you can see just below Austria-Hungary there, and I'll also be talking, of course, about Germany, Britain, France, and places like that as well. So hopefully this has helped you to locate those countries so you know whereabouts they are in Europe. Okay, so before we start our main task today, I think it's important that you are introduced to the two alliances that were formed before the start of the First World War. These two alliances were called the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. Now, it's important to actually mention the difference in the key words there, the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. The word Entente is more of an informal or friendly alliance between two countries, or three countries in this case. The Triple Alliance, on the other hand, is slightly different. An alliance is something that is formed between two or more countries for the purpose of benefiting each other in times of need. So what that might mean is, for example, Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy might unite together and go to war with a certain country. They might also defend each other if a nation was to invade one of them. So ultimately, they are joining together for the purpose of benefiting each other in a time of need. Now, you can imagine, guys, that when the Triple Alliance was formed officially in 1882, that led to an imbalance of power in Europe, because you've got these three countries in the centre of Europe connected with each other in an agreement to defend each other or attack together in a time of need. You can imagine how Russia and France would have felt when this first alliance was set up in 1882. They would have felt quite vulnerable neighbouring this collection of countries. So that's why the Triple Entente later was formed, to balance out that power. The Triple Entente was formed in 1907. This was between Britain, France and Russia, and largely they came together because of the worsening relations between Germany and Russia and Germany and Britain. And so these countries kind of united to balance out the power that was growing in the centre of Europe. Actually, these alliances didn't really balance out the power in Europe. Instead, what it left Europe with was two collections of countries, two groups that were formed that actually had tensions with each other. And what we're going to see throughout this lesson is how these groups started to then create further problems that then ultimately led to the First World War. Your task right now is to make sure that you've written down the names of the two alliances, and you've got to make sure you've written down the countries that are part of each alliance. Make sure that you pause the slide now to complete that quick task. Okay guys, so now that you've looked at the two alliances that were formed on the last slide, I'd like you now to have a look at this cartoon that was created at the time to show the impact of forming alliances. I want you to pause the video in a minute, just have a really good look at this for yourself and think about, what do you think the cartoon is trying to tell us about alliances and the impact? Pause it now for a moment and have a think about this on your own. Okay, so you should have come up with a few things about the impact of alliances after looking at this image. First of all, you'll want to probably know who each man is supposed to represent. Some of them you may have figured out and some of them you might not have done. The person at the front is supposed to represent Serbia. The second person is supposed to represent Austria-Hungary. The third person is supposed to represent Russia, and this person is Germany. And then you've got France and Britain at the back. Okay, so basically what this is trying to tell us in these speech bubbles by saying, if you touch me, I'll, if you make a move, I'll, if you hit that little fella, I'll, you get the picture. Ultimately, if the second person hits the first person, it's going to lead to a chain reaction, and each other person is going to hit the person in front of them. Now, one thing that you won't be aware of from the first activity is that Serbia, this first character, was actually in some ways allied and protected by Russia, which is this person. But we will understand from the first slide that we've just looked at that Austria was in an alliance with Germany. So what that means is that if Austria attacked Serbia, then Russia will get involved and attack Austria. But because Austria is friends with Germany, then basically Germany will attack Russia. And because France and Britain, who are running around behind, they are in alliance with Russia, that means that they collectively will attack Germany. So ultimately, the impact of alliances is that if two nations go to war, like, for example, these two nations at the front, let's say them two go to war. You've got Serbia and Austria at war with each other. Alliances mean that all of these other countries that previously were not involved are going to get dragged into it because they've basically allied with the other countries to say that they will perhaps support them or protect them in a time of need. Okay, so what that cartoon is trying to demonstrate is that actually, although alliances might be about trying to balance the power, actually what it will eventually lead to is countries getting dragged into a war that wasn't actually really to do with them in the first place. So for the rest of the lesson, we're going to be talking about the main causes of World War I. This came up in our title today, and it is going to be something you'll have to discuss at the end of the lesson. Now, Maine stands for 4 words: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Some of these words you might not be very familiar with. So the very first thing we need to do is to write down the definition of these words into our books or on our piece of paper if we don't have our book with us. So militarism is our first word. So we need to write down what it means. It means building up armed forces. So that might mean recruiting more men, building more ships, getting ready for war. Alliances, we've kind of already talked about this. It means agreements or promises to defend or help another country. Imperialism means trying to build up an empire. Now remember, I talked about empires earlier in the lesson. It means where a country will invade other parts of the world in order to create an empire, and those other parts of the world will become their colonies. An empire will then be controlled by one person. I talked earlier about the fact that Britain used to have an empire where Britain controlled lots of other countries around the world, and the King or the Queen of England would be in control of that empire. So other countries would also want to build an empire, largely because it made them more powerful and it also made them more rich. So some countries were basically challenging each other to see who could create the biggest empire and invade the most territory. Nationalism is the final one. That means having such pride in your country, you're willing to fight for it and defend it. Some people at this time were nationalists because they were part of an empire and they believed their country was something they should be proud of, and they wanted independence from the empire and they wanted to have their own government and their own rules. So those people might have also believed in nationalism. So I want you to write down these 4 definitions into your books. Make sure you write down the word and what it means. Okay, so for the rest of the lesson, we're going to be looking at the main causes of war in action. So what I'm going to need you to do first of all is to draw a chart like the one below into your books or on your paper as neatly as you can. You're going to need to make sure that you've got the one line going down and you've got to have the one line going across. Obviously, as I said, you will have a ruler, so hopefully yours looks a lot neater than mine. But then once you've done your lines, you will need to write down the subheadings in each box: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. You're going to be making bullet pointed notes into these boxes, so make sure that you've got room for that. You might want to pause this video now, just so that you can complete the chart before you continue. So for this task, you're going to read each of these boxes with information in, and you're going to place each one into the correct section of your chart. We're going to do the first 2 together so that you know what to do. So first of all, it's really, really important that you have your definitions in front of you for militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism, because you're going to need to decide if each one of these boxes belongs in the militarism box, the alliance box, the imperialism box, or the nationalism box. But you will only be able to do that if you know what the words mean, so that's why you need to have the definitions in front of you. So we're going to do the first 2 together, and you might want to write these into the boxes as we go through them. So France and Britain had big overseas empires. Germany wanted some too. So that's our first example. France and Britain had big overseas empires. Germany wanted an overseas empire too. Which one do you think that is? Do you think it's militarism, alliances, imperialism, or nationalism? I'm going to tell you guys, and I hope you got this right if you were thinking on your own, it's imperialism. Because imperialism is about the building up of empires, and what that does is it causes competition between these countries. So when Germany wanted to build up its own empire, it threatened the superiority of Britain's empire at the time, and that caused tension, which would ultimately lead to war. Let's have a look at the second one together. So this one here. Some countries wanted to rule themselves. They were very nationalistic. So, for example, countries that were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Places like Bosnia is a particular example that was in the Austro-Hungarian Empire but wanted to be independent. So what do we think that's an example of? Is that militarism? Is it alliances? Is it imperialism? Or is it nationalism? Again, I hope you guessed this right. It's nationalism, because it's about countries wanting to rule themselves, having so much pride in their nation that they believe it deserves its own government and its own rights to independence. That ultimately could lead to war, because if countries want to gain their independence, quite often it will lead to a war. Countries quite often in the past have had to fight for their independence from empires. So I'm going to leave you to now do the rest of them on your own. You're going to need to read each box carefully and write it down into the correct column or section, of your box. So the next one that you're going to look at for number 3 is going to be this one here, the building up of armies. Decide where that goes. Are you going to place it in the militarism box, the alliance box, the imperialism box, or the nationalism box? Off you go, guys. Have a think about this one on your own. Make sure you pause the slide so that all of this information stays put. Well done for having a go at that last task on your own, Year 8. What we're now going to do is check your answers to make sure that you've put the correct points in the correct boxes. Let's look at militarism first of all. The first one you should have down is the building up of armies made countries nervous. They responded by forming alliances. Some of you may have thought that goes in the alliance box, but actually it's militarism, because it's the building up of the forces that leads to countries forming alliances because they feel nervous. So the initial cause is militarism. The second one is that Germany was building its own navy. Britain didn't like this at all. Britain had the largest navy in the world at this time, and so they didn't like the competition. Other countries were also scared of this, and they began building their own armies to defend themselves. And of course, that leads to further tension. In terms of alliances, you should already know about the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente from earlier in the lesson, but you also needed to write down that the alliance system was supposed to prevent war, but it actually just dragged more countries into it. It meant that more countries got involved. The third one, imperialism, we did the first one together, so you should already have that one down. But the second one that you needed to get down was that lots of countries wanted to build up their empire with colonies of their own. And nationalism, again, we did the first one together. So you should also have all countries wanted to seem like they were the strongest. So this would, of course, lead them to do things like build up their militaries, build up their empires, because they wanted to seem like they were the strongest country. And they wanted to compete with others. But also, there were lots of nationalistic feelings at this time. So, for example, France previously had lost land and territory to Germany in the Franco-Prussian War that happened between 1870 and 71. Now, France ultimately had desires to get back that land. Ultimately, they would have to fight for it, so that would also lead to war. I hope you managed to get all of these correct, guys, and if you didn't, don't worry, but please can you make sure that you correct those now, that you have the chance before we move on. Okay guys, now that you've finished going through the answers for the last task, I hope you've got some really good examples in front of you now of militarism, alliances, imperialism and nationalism. What you've now got to think about is why each one of these things would cause war. Now, particularly for question 2, we actually talked about that at the beginning of the lesson. Why would alliances cause war? But I also want you to think about the other ones as well. Why would militarism cause war? Why would imperialism cause war? Why would nationalism cause war? I want you to try and make sure you've got an answer for each of those questions in your books or on your paper. Question 5 is really important. This one is asking you overall, which of these causes was the most important one for causing World War I? The reason I'm saying this one is important because I want you to think about this on your own, but I also want you to share your answer for question 5 on Teams with your teacher using the question and answer box. So make sure you have a really good think about it and then share your answer with your teacher. Your teacher will also go through some of the answers for questions 1, 2, 3 and 4 on Teams live in the last 5 minutes. And hopefully this will allow you to check your answers as well. Thank you so much for listening to this lesson, Year 8. I hope you've enjoyed getting started with our World War I topic. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.